The Taliban marked 1 year since they retook power in Afghanistan. The group says the country is moving forward, but millions of people are hungry and millions of girls aren't in school. So what's needed to turn things around? This is All 24 News special coverage. Hello there and welcome to the program. I'm Karifa Zachary. On August 15, 2021, the Taliban toppled the internationally recognized Afghan government and seized power, consolidating its tight grip over the war-torn country. 1 year later, the country is facing multiple challenges that demand immediate global attention. The extremist group has jailed and beaten journalists and right defenders who have protested the Taliban's severe restrictions on women's rights and press freedom.
Rare protests took place in the city of Kabul in Afghanistan on Saturday, when dozens of Afghan women's rights activists took to the streets of the capital, calling for work, freedom, and demanded the international community to help them. All of a sudden, the scene almost turned violent when Taliban security forces fired warning shots in the air to disperse the protests. However, there were no reports of injuries.
Today we staged a protest in Central City. The protest was against the Taliban's 1 year in power, because they don't have any agenda for governing. Girls' schools are still closed. Women are being fired from their jobs for no reason. Poverty is increasing. So for all good reasons, we were protesting. Our protest turned violent as the Taliban started shooting warning shots in the air, and they even detained some of the female protesters. There were around 20 to 30 Taliban firing warning shots to disperse the protest.
The protests occurred just days ahead of Taliban's first anniversary in power, after the withdrawal of US and NATO forces from Afghanistan. Afghan women have been fighting for their rights since August last year, the year which Taliban took rule of the country and ended 4 decades of conflict. However, girls were banned from high schools and many women were not allowed to work. Billions of dollars in aid have been cut off from the country. The latter plunged into a major humanitarian crisis, which paralyzed the economy due to these sanctions, and the most affected ones are ordinary Afghans' families.
All right, let's now bring in our guests. We have from the UK, Dr. Yvonne O'Reilly, journalist and political analyst specialized in Afghanistan region, as well as Abdullah Al-Hassan, professor of comparative civilizations from the US. Very warm welcome to both of you. Let's start with you, Mrs. Yvonne. Since you are specialized in the topic, after what we heard from the Taliban a year ago, all those promises to change the country to the better, are you surprised? What is life like there?
Not really, because when those promises were made at that astonishing press conference, which put women's rights first and foremost, the Taliban had an economy that they could work with. Within months, that economy was frozen, the banks were frozen, overseas assets were frozen by the Americans. And I defy anyone to try and run any country without a viable economy. So whatever plans that they had and announced, that they haven't been able to fulfill because of these problems. I am disappointed about the schools for senior girls, but about 14, 15 provinces are ignoring that command. And the girls are still going to school, as are girls in private schools. So that's still going. However, It is not at all good that teenage girls in about 20 of the provinces are still unable to access their education.
But at the beginning, the Taliban was very keen to reassure the international community that they are considering an inclusive political system and would not let the country again become a hub for terrorists. And at the same time, they said that they would guarantee women's rights there. So what are the outcomes so far, if you've been following?
Well, forced marriages have been banned. The selling of children as child brides has been banned. So these are positive moves for women and their daughters. These aren't acknowledged, unfortunately. Women are still in the workplace. Women are still going about their business. And as we saw from your introduction, women are wearing hijabs, veils, all manner of Islamic dress. And again, if you just listen to the Western media, women are not going out, women are not in the workplace. And this is clearly wrong. When I was there in May, I saw many women going to work on a morning, and I saw many women walking about shopping. So, we have to beware of false narratives.
Absolutely. In such case scenario, we always have false narratives. And of course, the majority of women, let's say, who are Muslim over there, do not mind wearing the hijab. But we have seen still a lot of protests of women going to the streets, demanding their equal rights side to side to men, at least for education. And then the dire situation, the humanitarian crisis that we are witnessing in Taliban, is there a party to blame here? Can we say that the US, by failing miserably in tackling the situation there, actually is the one to blame?
Absolutely. When Joe Biden used his executive powers to announce in April last year that the US troops would withdraw and be out by September 11, he could so easily have used those same powers to unfreeze the assets and prevent a humanitarian disaster, which was further compounded, of course, by the biggest earthquake suffered in Afghanistan in 20, 30 years. So, they've had a lot of man-made and natural disasters thrown at them in the last 12 months.
Very nice indeed. And now let's talk about the economic concerns and the situation overall in Afghanistan. With Afghanistan's economic crisis, billions of dollars in aid and reserves have been cut off, and ordinary people who have very little money for their necessities, and many families are struggling to make ends meet now. What can be done further here to help these people?
Well, the international community can grow a spine and stand up to Washington and say these sanctions are intolerable because innocent men, women and children are suffering as a result. The country has been aid dependent for the last 20 years under a US occupation. So it wasn't as though there were riches for the masses during the US occupation. It wasn't like that at all. The Taliban are going out, to use a cricketing analogy, they're going out to bat with one arm behind their back and a ball and chain around their leg. Whether you like them or not is irrelevant. No one can run an effective government under the sanctions that have been imposed by America, which have ensured that Afghanistan's sovereign assets overseas are frozen. And the outgoing government, let's not forget, some of their ministers looted millions as they fled the country. So, this money doesn't belong to the Taliban, it belongs to the Afghan people. and they have a right to be able to put food on the table. And the US president and the whole cabal in the international community have stopped that from happening.
In such scenarios, Dr. Yvonne, generally we see that people call for national reconciliation, trying to bring the internal fronts together so as to lead an effective government. Here, how do you see this government under Taliban? Do you think that it can be a legitimate government that can actually run the concerns of the people? And maybe if there are any, let's say, violations, international community can stand their witness and then intervene when it's necessary?
Well, it's impossible to run any sort of government without the assets that a government needs, which is, liquid assets, cash. They're struggling, although they are being quite inventive. And, let's remember that the Taliban were actually running a parallel administration in the south for about 10 years. So it's not as though this is new to them. They've been out of power for 20 years, which has given them plenty of time to think about what they're going to do when they get into power. And of course, they made it quite clear that they would be promoting their own values, which might be at odds with Western values. And, why not? We shouldn't force our culture onto Afghan people just in the same way as we would be outraged if the Afghans tried to force their culture onto us. We should, and one of the things that the Taliban did, which confounded their critics, was did reach out to the ethnic minorities in the Tajik, Hazara, and Uzbek communities, and they did say that they would have an inclusive government. But I mean, this interim government hasn't been given a fair shot yet. It needs to be able to function properly, and then, and only then, can we really judge the character and nature of this government.
And Dr. Yvonne, international communities have called for aid to be released, and Western governments don't want to look like they are supporting the Taliban. How is this being discussed in Western capitals?
Well, you have the spineless politicians who are in power, who are making all sorts of excuses, often citing a lack of girls' education for the reason for not releasing funds. But these same politicians threw Afghan women under the bus during the George Bush and Tony Blair era, when they said that they were going in to liberate the Afghan women, and then immediately joined forces with the Northern Alliance, which had a history of rape, looting. They had warlords like General Rashid Dostum, who had committed atrocities, and so at the time, the Revolutionary Afghan Women's Association were outraged that the West was going to betray them by swapping one brutal regime for another. So, these politicians use women's rights willy-nilly, and they will trample over women again once relationships are established with the Taliban, because at the moment the Taliban are sitting on $3 trillion worth of minerals, including lithium, which Elon Musk said recently is the new oil.
Very nice indeed.
So, people countries are going to want to make friends very soon with the Taliban. And when they do, they'll trash women's rights because they use and abuse them and exploit them to suit their own purposes.
Very nice indeed. And Mr. Abdullah, international communities have called for aid to be released for Afghanistan or Afghan government. Yet again, they fear that perhaps this aid could be turned against the West. Maybe it could be looted or used for personal purposes, and they don't want to seem that they are supporting the Afghan government. What is your general reading of the situation now, Mr. Abdullah?
Actually, I think these are all excuses. I live in the US, I live in Chicago. I see a lot of NGO activities to help the Afghan refugees here. And I don't think that there is any lack of sincerity here. But when it comes to Afghanistan itself, I think NGOs have very little say on the government policy. And that is why the governments are doing whatever they want. And it is the so-called, you can say, establishment or some kind of forces which really does not want to see any progress in Afghanistan. The lack of will, you can say, on the part of most Western countries.
But perhaps the Western countries have the right, to question the integrity of such a government, and especially seeing that their promises were broken regarding rights, for example, of women to education, for instance.
Yeah, I am not very happy about what I hear. I don't have field information. But what I hear in the media is that, yes, they are closing down they are not allowing teenage girls also to go to school, which is very devastating. But I don't really know the ground situation.
Do you think perhaps it is some kind of false narrative from media that they are trying to demonize the Taliban?
It's a possibility. But at the same time, I would say that, NGOs should try to reach out to them and talk to them. And there are so many Islamic NGOs who can argue with them based on Quranic values. And therefore, this engagement is very important.
And Mr. Abdullah, excuse me, undermining women's rights did not end with cabs on women's education. It also expanded to their clothes and movements. Why is the Taliban doing or making such decisions, according to you?
I wish I could answer to your question. I don't have access to Taliban.
Yes. So
I can, if I were there.
A unique culture, Mr. Abdullah. When a person has a unique culture,
it is not just Taliban. Yeah.
Come again, Mr. Abdullah?
It is not just Taliban. The whole Afghan culture is such that they are reluctant to open up as far as dress is concerned to, Afghan women or whatever. I think even Ridley would be able to say better on this. I don't have first-hand information on that.
Very nice indeed. And here I would like to address this question to Mrs. Yvonne. Dr. Yvonne, given the splits we are seeing within the Taliban themselves, can we say this is causing division on the ground within the communities as well?
Well, I'm not sure what splits you're referring to. Certainly, every single Afghan minister that I spoke to in May was in agreement that women had a right to education. And when I tried to find out who is the source of the blockage, I couldn't. So if there are divisions within the Taliban, they're keeping them very well hidden and they're putting on a united front. And this strength of unity that they have, it's their strength. and it's also their weakness because they won't break ranks publicly. I think that a lot of Western media would like to think that they're knocking seven bells out of each other behind the scenes. But at the moment, they're putting on a united front, and it's quite clear the leadership wants to take the country in a new direction with values that are quite different to Europe and America. But, you know, when you talk about women's rights, I was encouraged to see that the women were not afraid to go out onto the street and demonstrate. I was quite heartened by that. Why the Taliban had to use their guns to fire in the air, I don't know. It made them look weak. But when I see women demonstrating in America for their rights to have a choice on contraception issues and abortion issues, we see them, tear gas being thrown at them. We see them being arrested and by the police. We see that women are being baton charged across Europe in forces, and we've also seen women, you know, being arrested in Britain trying to stand up for their rights as well. The reality is that women's rights are being trashed right around the world, not just in Afghanistan. In fact, down the road in India, the hijabs are being pulled off the heads of young schoolgirls, and schools are actually being shut in India for Muslim girls. Now, you tell me why those Muslim girls are denied an education in India and no one bats an eyelid. But while they're working on a new curriculum in Afghanistan and they've postponed the education for secondary girls, there's such an outcry. You know, this disparity, this double standards has got to stop.
Absolutely.
And this is, and it's blatant for everyone to see.
Very nice indeed. Thank you so much for all these comments. And Mr. Abdullah, we keep talking about food security around the world. Recently, last winter, there were talks about the possibility of famine in Afghanistan going into the lean season. It does seem that somehow that was staved off. How did that actually happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, I'm not sure how it might have happened because, as I said, I don't have full information. But I think, generally speaking, Taliban has succeeded in maintaining the order, which was the main challenge for Afghanistan.
Can this be considered as a victory to the Taliban government?
Definitely. Definitely. One should give this credit to them. Of course, this problem of so-called ISIL and this ISIL of Khorasan, these are, I don't know what kind of individuals these people are, and they're creating this security problem there. But I think to a great extent, I mean, keeping in view that what has been happening in Afghanistan for the last 40 years, this minor incidents that are happening, that has happened, say, during the last 1 year during Taliban rule, should be minor. Therefore, I think we should give credit to Taliban for bringing this order. And I think to a great extent, we have not seen disaster in Afghanistan. I think this credit also should go to Taliban. But one should talk to them, one should negotiate with them about these issues. And of course, I mean, there are ways, even though international community might not recognize them, yet they should try to reach out to people through Pakistan, through Iran, these border states, and minimize the sufferings of common people.
And Dr. Ivan, some of the most extreme needs of food that we have been seeing are in rural areas in Afghanistan. So many people, though outside Kabul, just wanted the fighting to stop. Now we are seeing this relative peace. At the same time, economic challenges are mounting. How are the people outside Kabul viewing the Taliban now, according to you, given the kind of dichotomous situation they are in?
Well, 70% of the population of Afghanistan lives in the rural areas. And some winters during the US occupation, people were digging through snow to try and find grass just to put in their mouths. As I say, this country, 75% of it is aid dependent. And this is largely the rural areas. So sadly, these people have suffered hardship all their life. But what they told me was at least now they can sleep soundly at night without fearing Americans or other soldiers charging into their homes, without missiles raining down, targeting them. And when I went out into the rural areas and some of the very remote rural areas, they looked at me and said I was the first Westerner they'd met without a gun. Every woman that I spoke to through a translator, because these aren't educated women who were able to attract media attention, but every woman that I spoke to had a heartbreaking tale to tell of husbands killed, brothers, sons, uncles disappeared, missiles coming into their homes, and the injuries that some of these women have suffered are horrific. But, they were abandoned by the educated elite in Kabul, most of whom have now fled.
Very clear indeed. And Mr. Abdullah, do you think there is a huge difference between how people feel in the capital versus those in the rural areas, particularly that now the security situation has changed?
Actually, Taliban was in control of the rural areas throughout the last 20 years. And therefore, I think there has not been much change in the rural areas as far as I can understand. But I would like to make a point here about the Taliban character. You see, when in last year, August 15, when the US finally withdrew, if the Taliban did not follow Islamic teachings, I mean, they could have massacred the fleeing US troops. They did not. And this credit should be given to them because they claim that they follow Islam, and in this they have followed, and they should be given this credit. And this should, I mean, this is so shame on the part of the United States that they have blocked this fund that they have.
Have you imagined a different scenario from how the U.S. would withdraw? And what is your opinion and comment about how it actually withdrew from the country?
Well, I mean, Trump had declared that U.S. will withdraw. And he, I think, declared sometime in April. And then after Biden came to power, he implemented it suddenly. I don't think that they had any plan. They were seeking Pakistan's assistance, and Pakistan completely denied to provide any assistance. And therefore, they had to do it on their own. Qatar, of course, helped in this whole evacuation. But if the Taliban had wanted to inflict sufferings to the fleeing forces, they could have done so much of damage to the fleeing forces.
And as a final,
I don't think that it has been recognized by the international community and the media.
And as a final question, Dr. Ivan, can you tell us what could be the best solution in the situation in Afghanistan, and how could the U.S. handle the matter differently?
All the US has to do is lift the sanctions and allow the Taliban to govern. I'm sure that as soon as that happens, the floodgates will open for trade. We already know that the Russians and the Chinese are very keen to do business in Afghanistan, and we also know that their trade ministers have reached out to Iran, which would have been unthinkable in the 90s, but this is the new inclusive Afghanistan. China wants to open its own Silk Road route and have this amazing trade corridor, which would really benefit Afghanistan. And as I say, the Afghans are sitting on $3 trillion worth of minerals that are desperately needed for new and modern technologies. Lithium, as Elon Musk said, is the new oil. There could be an absolutely wonderful spree and an economic bloom for the Afghan people. But none of this can happen until America lifts the sanctions. People don't want to be aid dependent. The Taliban don't want to govern a nation of people with begging bowls. They want to empower the nation, create jobs, have a flourishing economy, and all of this can be done.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ivan. We have reached the limit of our time. Special thanks for our guests joining us today, and thank you to dear viewers for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our YouTube channel, and for further discussion or updates, go to our Facebook and Instagram pages. You could also join the conversation on Twitter. From me, Karim Zachary, and the whole team here in All 24 News in Algiers, best regards and bye for now.